Picture this: a drawing room in the middle of the afternoon, and every person who matters in this part of England seated inside it. The fire going, the tea poured, the silver laid out on the sideboard with the particular precision that only a household run properly for generations ever quite achieves, and the Duke of Breckmore standing at the center of it all, holding a glass of brandy at 3 in the afternoon, announcing to the assembled guests that Miss Lucinda Farwell, the woman beside him in the pale green dress, the woman who has been attending these gatherings for the past 4 months, the woman who arrived in the county with a letter of introduction from a baronet in Shropshire and a smile that understood exactly what it was doing, would henceforth be received as the true mistress of Breckmore Hall. The room went very quiet, and at the far end of the room, near the window with the view of the north gardens, a young woman in a gray dress set down her teacup on the side table. With care she rose. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of Miss Farwell and curtsied with the composed exactness of someone who has performed this action 10,000 times, who could do it in her sleep, who had in fact spent the last 7 months doing it every single day in this very house. "Welcome," she said. Her voice did not waver. Her eyes held Miss Farwell's for precisely 2 seconds. Then she turned, collected her shawl from the chair near the door, and walked out of Breckmore Hall. Not quickly, not slowly, at the pace of a woman who has somewhere better to be, and who has only just understood where that is. Behind her, 30 people exhaled, and that was how it began, or rather, how it ended. Depending on where you start the story, Vivian Alderton had arrived at Breckmore Hall 7 months earlier as a lady's companion, which was not a lie exactly, though it was not the whole truth either. The whole truth was considerably more complicated. She was 24 years old. She had grown up at Hartwell Park in Devonshire, the eldest child of Sir Robert Alderton, a man of modest title and immodest debts who had died 3 years earlier, leaving behind 3 daughters, 1 small estate, and a creditor's situation that his solicitor described with the careful understatement of a man trying not to alarm anyone prematurely. Vivian had not been alarmed prematurely. She had been alarmed precisely on time, which was the morning her father's solicitor, a thorough and unhurried man named Mr. Drummond, had arrived at Hartwell Park with a leather bag, and an expression she would later come to associate with bad news delivered honestly. He had laid out the situation across the breakfast table while her younger sisters were still upstairs. The estate had been entailed. The debts were There was a trust, a modest one, established by her maternal grandmother, but it had been signed over. Vivian had not been told this. She was not certain her father had meant for her to know. She sat at the breakfast table for a long time after Mr. Drummond finished speaking. The morning light came through the windows at the particular angle it always came through in October, catching the dust motes above the sideboard. The coalboard, the cloak. She asked one question: who now held the trust? Mr. Drummond looked at her over his spectacles. "Breckmore," he said. "The Duke of Breckmore. Your father arranged it 2 years ago, just before his decline began. The details are," he paused, "somewhat irregular. I have been attempting to understand them fully before approaching you." Vivian looked at the sideboard. She looked at the morning light. She looked at the place where her father used to sit. "I would like to understand them fully too," she said. It took another 6 weeks and a great deal of careful correspondence before she understood completely. By then she had made a decision. By then she had written to the agency in London. By then she had a gray dress and a small trunk and a letter of reference that described her as a competent and reliable lady's companion, which she was, though that was not why she was going to Breckmore Hall. She was going because the trust that had been her grandmother's bequest, that had been set aside for her and her alone, that her father had transferred without her knowledge in the last confused months of his decline, sat in the hands of a man who had almost certainly known exactly what he was doing when he accepted it. She was going to get it back. Breckmore Hall was not what she had expected. She had expected grandeur arranged for effect, the kind of house that announces itself loudly from the end of a long drive. What she found instead was something older and more settled, stone the color of winter light, ivy along the east wing, a kitchen garden that wrapped around the south side, with a slightly wild thoroughness that suggested someone had once cared for it a great deal and then stopped. The housekeeper, a stout and observant woman called Mrs. Crofton, received her at the door with the assessing gaze of a woman who had seen many companions come and go, and had formed opinions about all of them. She looked at Vivienne. She looked at the trunk. She looked at Vivienne again. "You'll do," she said, which Vivienne later understood was as warm a welcome as Mrs. Crofton offered to anyone. The woman she had been engaged to companion was Lady Euphemia Breckmore, the Duke's great-aunt, 73 years old, in possession of a mind like a finely calibrated instrument and a tolerance for pretense that was approximately zero. She received Vivienne in her sitting room on the second floor, looked at her for a long, unhurried moment, and said, "You're not actually a companion, are you?" It was not a question. Vivienne sat across from her in the chair by the fire and said, "I am competent at the work. That," Lady Euphemia said, "is not what I asked." There was a silence. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. "No," Vivienne said. "Not exactly." Lady Euphemia looked at her for another moment. Then she rang for tea. "Well," she said, "I suppose you had better tell me what exactly means, and we'll go from there." She did not tell her everything. Not that first afternoon. But Lady Euphemia was a woman who asked questions with the patient precision of someone who has been doing it for 73 years and has never once accepted a partial answer as a whole one. By the third week, Vivienne had told her most of it: the trust, her father, the transfer, the signature on the documents that her father's hand had made shaky and uncertain, so different from the strong, clear signature she knew from his letters. The dates which Mr. Drummond had noted with careful neutrality, that placed the transfer at a time when her father's decline had been sufficiently advanced to raise questions about his full comprehension of what he was signing. Lady Euphemia listened to all of it. She asked questions in the places where questions were warranted. She did not offer sympathy and she did not offer outrage. She offered attention, which was better than either. When Vivienne finished, the old woman was quiet for a moment. "How much do you know about my nephew?" she said. "The Duke." "Not enough," Vivienne said honestly. "No," Lady Euphemia said, "probably not." She looked at the window. "He is not a villain. I want you to understand that before you proceed, because it matters. He is a man who has always been able to convince himself that what is convenient for him is also what is right. These are not the same thing. He rarely understands this distinction." She reached for her teacup. "He did not steal from your father," she said. "He simply did not ask the questions that should have been asked. He saw an opportunity, and he took it, and he arranged his thinking around it afterward. This is," she added with a dryness that had clearly been refined over decades, "extremely common in men of his position." "What do you think I should do?" Vivienne said. Lady Euphemia looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this question. "I think," she said, "you should understand everything there is to understand before you do anything at all." Breckmore Hall had 41 rooms and a staff that had not been properly managed in some time. Vivienne understood this within the first month, not from anyone telling her but from paying attention, the way she had always paid attention, the way her mother had taught her, which was to notice what was not said as carefully as what was. The linen stores were in poor order. The kitchen accounts were irregular in the particular way that suggested someone was helping themselves to the margins. The north guest rooms had not been properly aired in over a year. The garden was beautiful in parts and completely neglected in others, with no evident logic to which parts had received care and which had not. Lady Euphemia noticed her noticing. "If you had run this house," she said one afternoon, "would it look like this?" "No," Vivian said. "Of course not," Lady Euphemia said. She said it not unkindly. More the way you state a fact that has bearing on a larger conversation. She saw the Duke for the first time on a Thursday morning in November, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival. He came in from riding, muddy and good-humored, and passed through the entry hall, just as Vivian was crossing it with a stack of correspondence she had been sorting for Lady Euphemia. He was not what she had constructed in her mind. She had built, over the months of reading documents and thinking carefully about what kind of man does. What kind of thing? A particular image. Something colder. Something more deliberate. What she saw instead was a man of about 40 who moved through his own house with the easy comfort of someone who has never had serious cause to question whether he belonged somewhere. He was not handsome in any careful, considered way. He was the kind of man who takes up space naturally, who does not arrange himself for observation. He glanced at her, nodded in the way one nods at staff, and continued toward the staircase. She had curtsied. Of course she had. That was what the gray dress required. He had not noticed anything about her at all. This was, she told herself that night, exactly what she needed. She was not entirely sure she believed it. The winter was long at Breckmore Hall. The social calendar of the county ground forward with its particular rhythm. Dinners, card parties, morning calls, the occasional assembly at the town hall in the village. And Vivian attended many of these events in her capacity as Lady Euphemia's companion. She was good at this. She was good at being present without being noticed, at listening to conversations that were not directed at her, at remembering names and connections, and the small precise details that told you who was genuinely important and who was performing importance. She learned. She learned a great deal. She learned that the Duke had been managing Breckmore's finances with less care than the estate required, that there were properties in the north that had not turned a profit in 3 years, that the improvements to the tenant farms, which ought to have been completed the previous summer, had been quietly deferred without announcement. She learned about Lucinda Farwell, not immediately and not in any single conversation, but gradually, the way you learn anything in a county house in winter, through accumulation, the mention of a name, a glance exchanged between 2 women at a card table, a comment about a property in Shropshire from which a letter of introduction had come. She learned that Lucinda Farwell had arrived in the county 4 months ago, not before Vivian but alongside her in the social calendar, a woman of 30 who was beautiful with the particular brightness of someone who knows exactly how to present it. She had attached herself to the Duke's circle with a speed and sureness that impressed even those who did not admire her. She learned something else, too, through Mr. Drummond, who had remained in careful contact. That Lucinda Farwell had been in proximity to 2 other wealthy men in the past 6 years in circumstances that had each concluded with those men in a significantly reduced financial and social position. She filed this information the same way she filed everything, carefully, without rushing toward conclusions. She was, Lady Euphemia observed on a February afternoon, extremely patient for someone whose situation was urgent. "I have learned," Vivian said, "that urgency is expensive." Lady Euphemia looked at her over her spectacles. "Your father's daughter," she said. Then, after a pause, "he was a better man than he was a businessman. I want you to know that. I knew him, a little, when we were young. He was kind. He was simply not attentive in the right directions." Vivian looked at the fire for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I know." Spring arrived, and with it the county's most significant social gathering of the season, a reception at Breckmore Hall itself, hosted by the Duke, attended by everyone of any consequence within 30 miles. Vivienne had helped organize it. This was not strictly within her role as Lady Euphemia's companion, but Mrs. Crofton, who was 58, and had spent those 58 years developing an unerring instinct for competence, had observed Vivienne's management of Lady Euphemia's correspondence and household requirements for 4 months, and had, with characteristic directness, simply begun consulting her on larger matters. Viljean. Vivienne had not refused this. It was useful to understand the workings of the house. It was useful to know the guest list, the seating arrangements, the flow of the rooms. She also understood, by the time the reception was 3 days away, what the Duke intended to announce that afternoon. She had understood it for a week. She had understood it from the particular way Lucinda Farwell had been placed at the last 2 dinners, from the quality of the Duke's attention in her presence. From a conversation she had not been meant to overhear in the corridor outside the library, but had heard regardless. She had gone to Lady Euphemia that evening. The old woman had listened. She had been quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "What will you do?" Vivienne looked at the window, at the north garden in the spring evening light, the parts that were tended and the parts that were not. "I will see Mr. Drummond," she said, "this week, before the reception." Lady Euphemia nodded slowly, and then, Vivienne said, "I will be in that drawing room on Saturday afternoon." Mr. Drummond came on Thursday. He brought his leather bag and his careful expressions, and 3 documents that he spread across the table in Lady Euphemia's sitting room, while Mrs. Crofton brought tea and pretended with considerable professionalism not to be paying close attention. The documents were the result of 8 months of patient work. Mr. Drummond had been thorough in the way that good solicitors are thorough, which is to say, he had found things that someone had hoped would not be found. The original trust instrument, her grandmother's signature on it clear and unmistakable. The date of the transfer, the Duke's signature, the witness signature, and the date, which placed the transaction at a point when Mr. Drummond had, with some effort, obtained testimony from 2 separate sources that Sir Robert Alderton had been unwell enough to be considered, in the careful language of the law, not fully himself. It was not proof of malice, Mr. Drummond said. I want to be clear about that. It would not necessarily succeed as a claim of fraud. But, Vivienne said, but, he agreed, it is sufficient to make a very strong case for the invalidation of the transfer on grounds of incapacity, particularly if presented by counsel, particularly if the Duke wished to avoid the matter becoming a matter of public record. Vivienne looked at the documents. She looked at her grandmother's signature, still legible after all these years, a small neat hand that she could just barely remember watching write letters at the desk in the East Room at Hartwell Park. She picked up her pen. "Proceed," she said, "but not yet, after Saturday." Mr. Drummond looked at her for a moment. Then he placed the documents back in the leather bag. "As you direct," he said. The afternoon of the reception was warm for April, the light coming through the drawing-room windows in long, horizontal lines that caught the dust above the mantelpiece and made the silver on the sideboard look like it was lit from inside. 30 people, the county's assembled consequence, the tea poured, the cakes arranged, the fire going even though the day was warm enough to suggest it might not be strictly necessary. Leah Scotus. These things were done at Breckmore Hall because they had always been done, and Vivienne, who had quietly ensured they were done correctly, for the first time in recent memory watched from near the north window with the particular attention of someone who has arranged the room and knows exactly where everything is. She had worn gray. This was deliberate. It was the color she was supposed to wear. It was the color that made her invisible in this room, and she had chosen to be invisible until the precise moment she chose not to be. The Duke stood near the fireplace. Lucinda Farwell stood beside him in the pale green dress, the color of a woman who understands that she is being presented. Her hand was on his arm in the way that announced rather than touched. He raised his glass. The room quieted with the particular efficiency of a room that knows something is coming. Vivienne set down her teacup. The Duke spoke for perhaps 2 minutes. He spoke well, he always spoke well, and what he said was arranged with the smoothness of a man who has rehearsed it enough to believe it sounds spontaneous. He used the phrase true mistress of this house, which Vivienne noted with a kind of cold and specific attention, because it was precisely the phrase that revealed how little he had thought about what this room contained. 30 pairs of eyes turned to her. She was already moving, not quickly, not in any way that could be described afterward as flight or collapse or drama. She crossed the room at exactly the pace of a woman who has decided where she is going and finds the distance manageable. She stopped in front of Lucinda Farwell. Miss Farwell's eyes held triumph that was not quite concealed. She had expected something. Not this. Vivienne curtsied. It was precise and unhurried, and it used the full vocabulary of what a proper curtsy was supposed to say, which in this case was, "I know exactly who I am, and this changes nothing about that." She rose. "Welcome," she said. Then she turned, collected her shawl, and walked out of Breckmore Hall, not quickly, not slowly, at the pace of a woman who has somewhere better to be. Behind her, 30 people exhaled, and the conversation that followed, in drawing rooms and at card tables and over morning calls across the county for the next several weeks, was not about the Duke. It was not about Miss Farwell. It was about the woman, in the gray dress, the curtsy, the single word, the walk to the door. She didn't even look at him, they said. She just left. No one who had been in that room had any idea what happened next. What happened next was Vivienne Alderton walked 3/4 of a mile down the lane to the Merton Arms, where Mrs. Crofton had quietly arranged for a room the previous afternoon without being asked, because Mrs. Crofton was 58 years old and had been paying attention. She sat in the small room with the window that looked out over the coaching yard, and she did not cry. She had thought she might. She had allocated some internal space for it, had set it aside as a reasonable possibility for this particular evening. What she felt instead was something she had not expected. Not relief, not triumph, not grief, something quieter than any of those, something that required her to sit still for a long while before she could name it. She understood slowly, and then all at once, no longer pretending. For 7 months, she had worn the gray dress and answered to Miss Alderton, which was her name. It had always been her name, but stripped of everything that name was supposed to carry. She had curtsied and managed correspondence and arranged flowers and attended to a 73-year-old woman she had come to. She let herself say it, genuinely admire. She had been useful and competent and invisible. And now she was in a room at a coaching inn in April, with the window open and the smell of horses and road dust coming in the county she had grown up in. Not this county, that was Devonshire, but this kind of county, this particular texture of England in spring, laid out outside the window. Mr. Drummond was expected on Monday. She had 2 days. She opened the small bag she had carried out with her, the one that had been sitting packed under her bed at Breckmore Hall for the past 3 weeks. She took out a sheaf of papers. She spread them on the small writing desk. She picked up her pen. The first person to call was Lady Euphemia. She arrived on Sunday morning in a carriage that was rather too stately for the lane beside the Merton Arms, managed the cobblestones with the serene authority of a woman for whom the world had been adjusting since 1793, and walked into the inn's small parlor with the bearing of someone making a considerable point simply by being somewhere. She looked at the papers on the table. "You look," she said, "like someone who has made a decision and would like to be left alone to implement it." "Sit down," Vivian said. "Mrs. Hartfield will bring coffee." Lady Euphemia sat. The parlor was small and not particularly grand, and she occupied it with complete equanimity, which Vivian had come to understand was simply her way. "They are talking about you," Lady Euphemia said. "I imagine they are. They are saying the right things." Lady Euphemia accepted her coffee from Mrs. Hartfield, who looked rather awed and managed it professionally. The curtsy was, she paused, and the pause was, a form of expression, exactly right. "It was what I could do," Vivian said. "No." Lady Euphemia looked at her steadily. "It was what you chose to do. There is a distinction. You could have wept. You could have made a scene. You could have said something unforgivable to Miss Farwell that would have been entirely justified and entirely ruinous. You did none of those things." She looked at her coffee. "It was better than any of them." Vivian looked at the papers. The documents Mr. Drummond had shown her on Thursday. The figures she had been working through since Friday evening. The letter she had drafted and rewritten twice. "I am going to pursue the trust," she said, "through proper legal means. I believe we have sufficient grounds." "Yes," Lady Euphemia said. She was quiet for a moment. "He will not fight it." "How do you know?" "Because I know my nephew." She said it without sentiment, which was its own form of affection. He is not a man who examines what he would prefer not to examine. When he is made to look at it directly, he is also not a man who can sustain a position he cannot respect. She looked at Vivian. Whatever else he is not that. Vivian thought about the man who had passed her in the entry hall 4 months ago without seeing her at all. "He still doesn't know who I am," she said. "No," Lady Euphemia agreed. "That," she said, "is going to be an interesting conversation." Monday arrived with Mr. Drummond and his leather bag. Tuesday brought the formal letter to the Duke's solicitor. Wednesday brought a response from said solicitor in language that was measured and careful in the precise way of a man who has been shown something uncomfortable and is trying to determine how uncomfortable it actually is. Vivian read the response at the small writing desk at the Merton Arms, with the April light coming through the window and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. She wrote back in her clear and unhurried hand. She made 3 points. She made them concisely. She enclosed copies of 2 of the documents Mr. Drummond had assembled. Then she sent it and went for a walk along the lane that ran north out of the village, past the edge of the Breckmore estate, past the kitchen garden wall, past the orchard at the far end, where the apple trees were just beginning to come into blossom in a white rush that seemed excessive for April, extravagant, like something showing off. She stood at the wall and looked at them for a while. Behind her, in the hall, she understood that things were in motion. The Duke came to her on Thursday. He did not send word ahead. She had suspected he might not. He came in his own carriage without the full complement of outriders that would have announced the visit as formal, which told her something about the register he was attempting. He was working, she understood, towards something that felt less official than it was. She received him in the parlor. Mrs. Hartfield, who had developed a certain proprietal loyalty to her guest over the past week, brought tea without being asked, and gave the Duke the specific kind of service that communicated she had noticed which of them had been more consistently civil. He looked at Vivian for a long moment. She let him. "You are Sir Robert Alderton's daughter," he said. It was not a question. He had been told, evidently, between Wednesday and Thursday. "I am," she said. He was quiet. He looked at his hands, then at the window, with the expression of a man attempting to assemble something that resists assembly. "You came to my house," he said, as a companion. "Yes." She said it without apology. The work was done honestly. Lady Euphemia was well attended. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, several things in succession, that she observed with the careful neutrality she had been practicing for 7 months. "I'm not objecting to that," he said finally, which surprised her enough that she marked it. "Then what are you objecting to?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not certain I am objecting," he said. He said it slowly, like a man working out a position while he was speaking it, which she found reluctantly more honest than she had expected. "I think I am trying to understand what it is you want." "I want what was my grandmother's," Vivian said. "I want what my father intended for me. I want the trust restored." He looked at her directly then, with more steadiness than she had allocated for in her preparation for this conversation. "Your father was not." He stopped. He was careful in the last 2 years. He was not himself in the way that made the arrangements he was making more difficult to question than they should have been. "No," she said. "He was not." "I did not know," the Duke said. "I want to be clear that I am not saying this to defend myself." He said it in the tone of a man who has been sitting with something uncomfortable for several days and has arrived at a position through difficulty rather than convenience. "I accepted the arrangement as it was presented. I should have asked more questions." "I did not." There was a silence. Outside, a cart went by on the cobblestones. "No," Vivienne said again. "You did not." He looked at his hands again. "The trust will be returned," he said. "The legal process can be suspended. I will instruct my solicitor today." She waited. "I am also," he said, and here his voice changed slightly, became something less official and more uncertain, which she noted, at something of a loss regarding Saturday. She looked at him. It was, he said, a significant error. She thought about 30 people in a drawing room. She thought about Lucinda Farwell's expression and the weight of the look from the room and the walk across the floorboards, and the curtsy she had delivered with every muscle of her body precisely controlled. "Yes," she said. "It was." He did not ask her to return to Breckmore Hall. She had known he probably wouldn't, and she found she was glad he didn't, because the answer she had prepared was kind but absolute, and she had not been certain how he would receive it. What he did instead was stand and thank her, and walk out to his carriage with the bearing of a man who has set something down that he has been carrying for a while, and is still working out whether he feels better or worse for it. She watched the carriage go from the parlor window. Then she turned back to the writing desk and picked up her pen. There was someone else. She had not expected him. This was, she would understand later, part of why it mattered. His name was Thomas Halwick. He was the land agent for the estate that bordered the Merton Arms to the north. A position that brought him through the village several times a week, with the cheerful practicality of a man who has real work to do, and no particular interest in appearing to be doing something more important. He had been eating breakfast in the inn's common room the morning after she arrived and had looked up when she came in, not with the particular attention of a man assessing a woman, but with the straightforward interest of someone who notices things and doesn't bother to conceal it. "Good morning," he had said. "You're the woman from the Breckmore drawing room." "Yes," she had said. He had nodded, in the manner of someone filing information. "I'm Halwick, land agent," he added, as though his profession were a reasonable thing to mention before anything else. Something about this she had found, immediately, more restful than most introductions. He had gone back to his breakfast. She had sat 2 tables away and done the same. This was how it continued for a week. Breakfast in the common room. Conversation of the sort that happened sideways. About the orchard and the state of the lane after the April rain, and the particular difficulty of managing drainage on the north fields. He knew about land in the specific and particular way that came from spending one's days actually in it, from understanding what each acre required and what it was capable of, from treating knowledge as something you earned through proximity and time rather than something you performed. She found this refreshing in the way that she found Lady Euphemia refreshing, which was to say that it was a relief to be in the presence of someone who said what they knew and didn't say what they didn't. On the Friday after the Duke's visit, Howick appeared at the door of the parlor with his hat in his hand, and an expression that she was coming to understand meant he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. "I should tell you something," he said. She waited. "I was at the Breckmore reception," he said. "Saturday I was invited because of the Northfield business, some discussion the Duke wanted to have with several of us afterward." He paused. "I saw you." She looked at him. "I mean before that," he said. "Before Saturday. I had seen you twice in the village, in the autumn, and once at the Mertons' card evening in February." He was holding his hat carefully, turning it once in his hands. "I noticed you then. Not as." He started again. "I noticed that you were paying attention to everything in a room in a way that most people don't. It's a particular quality. I find it." He paused, and something crossed his face that might in a different context have been amusement at himself. Rare. Vivienne looked at him for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He met her eyes directly. "Because I have been your neighbor for a week, and your acquaintance for 7 months without knowing it, and I find I am running out of patience with not being honest." He was still holding the hat. He was not a man who made speeches or arranged himself for effect. She had understood this from the first morning, and it was the thing about him she was least prepared for, because she had spent 7 months in a house full of people who arranged themselves constantly and had forgotten what it felt like to talk to someone who simply didn't. She looked at the window, at the April light and the coaching yard and the lane running north toward the orchard she had walked past 3 times in the past week. "Mr. Howick," she said. "Yes, come walking with me tomorrow morning. I want to look at the orchard properly, and I find I am poorly qualified to judge apple trees." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but what comes just before one. "I am," he said, "reasonably qualified to judge apple trees." "Good," she said. "Then I would value your opinion." The legal matter resolved itself over the following 3 weeks with a thoroughness and relative quietness that Mr. Drummond attributed to the quality of the documents, and Vivienne attributed to the fact that the Duke was, as Lady Euphemia had said, ultimately a man who could not sustain a position he could not respect. The trust was restored. The paperwork was precise and complete. Mr. Drummond, arriving at the Merton Arms on a Thursday with the finalized documents, placed them on the writing desk with the expression of a man whose work was finished and who was satisfied with the results. "You have," he said, "done this with considerable patience." "I had a good teacher," Vivienne said. She meant Lady Euphemia, and she also meant her father, and she also meant the 7 months of gray dresses and paying attention, which had been their own form of education. "What will you do?" Mr. Drummond asked. "Now." She looked at the documents. She looked at the figures, which were, after 11 years of growth in the trust, genuinely surprising in their sufficiency. She looked at the window and the coaching yard and the lane she had walked along that morning with Howick, who had shown her which apple trees were worth keeping, and had then, without being asked, told her the proper management of the drainage issue on the north edge of the property, as though her interest in the matter was entirely unremarkable, which he clearly found it to be. "I have some ideas," she said. There was a house. There had always been a house in the trust documents, though she had not known it when she arrived, and had only found it in the 3rd week of reading through everything Mr. Drummond had assembled. It was a modest property, 4 miles from the village, on a parcel of land that included a small farm and a kitchen garden that had been properly maintained, and a view of the valley that on clear mornings made her understand why her grandmother had kept it. She walked through it on a Tuesday in May with Mrs. Crofton, who had tendered her resignation from Breckmore Hall the previous week with a directness that had apparently startled the Duke considerably, and had not startled Vivienne at all. Mrs. Crofton was 58 and had spent those 58 years developing judgment about where her competence would be properly valued. She walked through the house and said very little, which Vivienne had learned meant she was forming opinions she would deliver in full when she had finished forming them. In the kitchen, she opened the range. She tested the oven door. She looked at the shelves with the expression of a woman calculating. "It wants work," she said. "Yes," Vivienne agreed. 3 months, Mrs. Crofton said, "and a carpenter who is not Philby, because Philby does not understand joints." She paused. "It will be a good house." "It will," Vivienne said. Lady Euphemia came the following Saturday, arrived in her carriage with the equanimity of a woman for whom inconvenient lanes were simply a feature of the world rather than an objection to it, walked through every room, looked at the view from the east window for a long time, and said, "Your grandmother had excellent taste." "Did you know her?" Vivienne said. "A little." Lady Euphemia turned from the window. "She would be pleased, I think. Not about the circumstances. She would be furious about the circumstances. But about you." Vivienne looked at the view, the valley in May light, green in the particular way that England is green after rain, which is the only way it does anything by halves. "I have been furious about the circumstances," she said. "Yes," Lady Euphemia said. "And you have done something useful with it, which is rarer than you would think." She looked at the room with the satisfaction of a woman who has watched something she hoped for arrive. What comes next? What came next, in its particular order, was this. Mrs. Crofton hired the right carpenter, the one who understood joints, and the house was sound by August. The kitchen garden produced more than expected that first year because the soil, as Halwick had observed when he walked the property in June, was exceptionally good along the south edge and had simply needed the right attention. Mr. Drummond visited quarterly and expressed satisfaction with regular punctuality. Lady Euphemia came for 3 weeks in September and occupied the largest guest room, and frightened the new housemaid on the first morning, and had apologized by the afternoon in the particular way she apologized, which was to ask pointed questions about the housemaid's family and then remember the answers. The Duke wrote twice, not to ask for anything and not to revisit what had been, but to say, in the careful language of a man who was learning to write things he had previously arranged not to need to think about, that the North Tenant cottages were being properly repaired, that the drainage scheme had been carried out, that he had found, in the process of actually attending to the estate with the sustained focus he had previously given to other things, that it was considerable work, and that he understood now, more specifically than he had before, what understanding the whole of a property actually required. Vivienne wrote back both times, briefly, without warmth that was not genuine or coldness that was not warranted. She wished him well. She meant it. Lucinda Farwell was gone by June. This Vivienne heard through Halwick, who had heard it from the estate manager at Ashwick, who had heard it at the Thursday market in a way that suggested it had not been entirely voluntary. There was a new situation, it was said, a gentleman in Lincolnshire. Vivienne listened to this without satisfaction and thought briefly that she hoped the gentleman had a good solicitor. Halwick had asked her to walk on the first Tuesday of September, the same first Tuesday of most months, which had become by then simply what Tuesday mornings were. The way the things you begin honestly tend to become the things that hold. They had walked the south boundary of the property, where the drainage channel he had designed in July law was doing exactly what he had said it would do, which pleased him with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose predictions are based on actual knowledge. She had told him about Lady Euphemia's arrival. He had told her about a problem with the north fence that had turned out to be more interesting than problems with north fences usually were. She had asked him to stay for lunch, and he had, and they had eaten in the kitchen with Mrs. Crofton, who had decided within the first week of knowing Halwick that he was useful, which was the highest assessment she offered anyone. Afterward, in the garden in the September afternoon, he had said, "I should like to court you." Properly, with full knowledge of your situation, and without any expectation of speed. She had looked at him in the light that came across the valley that time of year, the light that was already starting to do something gold, and she had thought about the gray dress and the curtsy, and the walk out of Breckmore Hall and the room at the Merton Arms, and the documents on the writing desk, and the first morning in the common room when he had said, simply, "I'm Halwick, land agent." "On those terms," she said. "Yes." Something in his face settled in the way that things settle when they arrive where they were always going. He did not make a speech. He did not arrange the moment. He simply nodded, with the particular quality of honesty she had come to understand was not something he turned on for occasions, but something he simply was, all the way through. "Thank you for asking properly," she said. "It matters." "I know," he said. They were married the following April, quietly, in the village church, with the apple trees just beginning to come out in the white rush that still seemed to her too extravagant for April, too much, too beautiful, like something that didn't know how to be modest. Lady Euphemia attended and said nothing excessive and cried once, briefly, in the manner of a woman acknowledging that the moment warranted it and then returning to herself. Mrs. Crofton made a cake that was discussed in the village for the rest of the year. Mr. Drummond attended with the expression of a man whose work, in the deepest sense, had concluded well. On the morning of the wedding, before she dressed, Vivian walked the south boundary of that property alone, past the drainage channel that was doing what it was supposed to do, past the kitchen garden where the first green was beginning to come up, past the apple trees against the east wall that Halwick had said would bloom earliest. They were. She stood in the middle of the orchard for a while, doing nothing except being there, which she had learned over the past year was in fact its own kind of work, and one she had been very poor at before, and was getting better at slowly. The Duke of Breckmore, 30 people had said, that woman in the gray dress, the curtsy, the single word, the walk to the door. She had not been walking away. She had understood this only later, in the room at the Merton Arms with the window open and the papers spread on the writing desk and the sense, arriving quietly and entirely without drama, that the direction had always been forward. She went back inside. The morning was clear and cold and bright, and there was a great deal of it ahead.